Chapter 8. Octopolis. An armful of octopuses. These days the main place I watch octopuses is the site we call Octopolis, 50 feet below the surface off the east coast of Australia. As you swim down, on clear days the site is an Oz-like emerald green. On other days it's more like grey soup. I began visiting soon after Matt Lawrence discovered the site in 2009. The numbers at the site go up and down, but octopuses are always there. On the most intense days we'll count more than a dozen, roaming, grappling, or just sitting, all in and around an arena just a few yards across. Reports of clumps of octopuses had cropped up from time to time before, but Octopolis was the first site that could be visited year after year, with several animals always present and often interacting. Sometimes a single octopus seems to have some command of the site, but this command is often partial, as there are too many individuals for one octopus to deal with at once. At first we thought this might be a harem-type situation with one male and many females, but that turned out not to be right. Quite often there are multiple males present, though not too close to each other. It's hard to tell the sex of an octopus without interfering with it. In many species, the main difference is a groove under a male's third right arm, which is used in mating. That arm is stretched out toward the female, sometimes from close by, sometimes from cautious long range. If she accepts it, then a packet of sperm is passed along the underside of the arm. The females often then store the sperm for some time before fertilizing their eggs. From the outset, we've been determined to interfere with the octopuses as little as possible. We do interact with them, but only when they want to interact. We never pull octopuses from their dens, let alone turn them over and inspect their undersides. So the only way of reliably telling who is male and who is female is to watch how they behave and see who engages in the telltale arm stretches of a male. In this way we're often able to work out the sexes of some individuals at the site, though other cases remain uncertain. This evidence is enough for us to be sure that multiple males and multiple females are often present. Initially, Matt Lawrence and I would just go down and watch them, and whenever we came to the surface, we'd wonder what the octopuses would do once we were gone. For a while we could only speculate, but soon the small underwater GoPro video camera systems became available. We bought a couple of these, put them on tripods, and started leaving them down with the octopuses. The first time we recovered these cameras and watched the footage, we had no idea what we'd see. Footage of octopus behavior with no divers or submarines around had rarely been taken before. Would they behave completely differently when only a small camera was watching, and do something completely new? As far as we can tell, they behave fairly similarly whether or not we're there, though there is a little more roaming and interaction when we're absent. This was disappointing in one way, no secret group acrobatics, but reassuring in another, as it confirmed that our presence doesn't much bother them. Soon after this work began, a biologist working in Alaska, David Scheel, got in touch with me. David did his training studying lions in Africa. He spent weeks slowly following small groups of lions day and night in a Land Rover, recording how they roamed and hunted. He then switched animals and is now an expert on the largest octopus species, the giant Pacific octopus. These can weigh 100 pounds or more, and David sometimes has to wrestle one to the surface in freezing Alaskan water and get the animal into a boat for study at his lab. His is not one of the labs that routinely takes the animals apart, and he has done a lot of work tracking octopus movements by attaching small transmitters to their bodies and releasing them. David was keen to do some work on a different species, in warmer water. Soon he began making the trip down to Australia, and we had another person squashed into Matt's boat as we chugged out to Octopolis. With David's help, our thinking about the site became more systematic, and we spent more and more time measuring and counting. David is also much better than I am at imparting order to the massive video data we collect. He has a knack for sifting through the multi-armed chaos to find patterns and ask questions that can actually be answered. In the southern summer of 2015, joined also by Stefan Lindqvist, we spent a couple of days parked near the site on a larger boat, trying to cover just about every daylight hour with our unmanned video cameras. It's never quite possible to do this. One enemy of the cameras is the octopuses themselves. Our pale, head-like cameras on little tripods might look a bit like intruders of some kind. Perhaps static, erect, three-legged cephalopods. The cameras are sometimes closely inspected and occasionally attacked as they film. Then the file we end up with has a lot of close-up footage of suckers and bites. On other occasions, enormous stingrays come sweeping into the site and knock everything over. In January 2015, the stars aligned. We were able to record a lot of video and could not have picked a better time to do it. We saw an unprecedented level of activity, and some of the behaviors we'd occasionally seen earlier resolved into patterns. A single octopus, a large male, seemed determined to control access to the site. He policed it continually throughout daylight hours. He chased off some octopuses, fighting intensely if they did not retreat. He tolerated others. We think these were females, and sometimes herded them into dens if they wandered away. As an octopus roams over the shell bed, both the roamer and those in their dens will probe and sometimes lash at each other with their arms. We've seen a lot of arm probing over the years at the site, and I'd always thought of it in pugilistic terms. In our first paper, I described boxing as a frequent behavior. But Stefan Lindqvist, an amiable person, found himself thinking of many of these interactions as high fives, as arm slaps that seemed to facilitate recognition between individuals, or at least a registration of basic roles on the site. Sometimes two octopuses would probe or whip their arms and then settle back into a relaxed pose. Other times the arm pokes would be followed by a fight. All these behaviors are accompanied by continual color changes. Some of the color changes at the site seem quite unorganized and fit the chatter hypothesis I outlined in Chapter 5. Sometimes one of our unmanned cameras will film an octopus who seems, as far as I can tell, to be sitting quietly on his own, not interacting with another octopus or anything else, and he will run through a series of colors and patterns for no apparent reason. But other colors and patterns have more point to them. When an aggressive male is about to attack another octopus, he will often turn dark, rise out of the seabed, and stretch his arms out in a way that magnifies his apparent size. Sometimes he will raise his mantle, the entire rear part of his body, over his head. We call this the Nosferatu pose, after the silent film vampire of that name, with his dark cloak and threatening appearance. We'd seen cases of this pose before, but the male we watched trying to control the site in 2015 used it often. He would bear down on another animal who had to decide what to do. Sometimes the other one fled. Sometimes he stood his ground and a fight ensued. The Nosferatu male was not always larger than the other octopus, but he very rarely lost a fight. Only once, in fact, did he lose on film. David Schill was interested in the colours octopuses took on during these interactions, and he went back through our old films, charting hundreds of encounters between an aggressor and a target. He noticed that the darkness of skin colour is a reliable predictor of how aggressive an octopus will be, whether it will advance, whether it will stand its ground if another is coming. In contrast, several kinds of pale displays are produced when an octopus is not willing to fight. One of these is a bland pale grey, the other a stark, blotchy pattern. That blotchy pattern is also seen when cephalopods of various kinds are threatened by predators. It's called a diematic display, and its usual interpretation is that it's a last-ditch attempt to startle or confuse the foe. This raises the possibility that the diematic display is something that octopuses produce involuntarily whenever a threat is bearing down at them, and is not a signal to the other octopus when we see it at our site. However, a diamatic display is sometimes produced at our site when an octopus is making its way back to a den under the watchful eye of a more aggressive individual. Then there's no question of flight or any attempt to startle. So we think this display may have been pressed into service at Octopolis as something like a display of submission or non-aggression. Dark colours and the Nosferatu pose, on the other hand, seem to be displays that convey the seriousness of an aggressive move. Origins of Octopolis. Matt suspected this was an unusual place when he discovered it, but he did not realize quite how unusual it was. The most similar report was a controversial one from the tropical waters of Panama nearly 30 years earlier. In 1982, Martin Moynihan and Arcadio Rodanish reported finding an unusual-looking and hitherto undescribed octopus with bright stripes, living in a group of several dozen animals and sometimes sharing dens. They reported this as part of the study of reef squid that I described in Chapter 5, the study that claimed that squid have a language of colours and patterns on their skin. Moynihan and Rodanish had no photos or video of the wild animals. Underwater photography was a very different matter back in 1982, and there was not a lot of data that would be truly compelling to biologists. Moynihan and Rodanish prepared a fuller description of the octopus for publication, but it was rejected. The whole topic of Panama's gregarious, striped octopus was met with skepticism from other biologists for years, to Moynihan and Rodanish's frustration. It remained an enticing set of anecdotes until 2012, when the animal reappeared in the commercial aquarium trade. Some live specimens made their way to California, where they were kept by Richard Ross and Roy Caldwell of the Steinhardt Aquarium. In captivity, some of the unusual behaviours reported by Moynihan and Rodanish were confirmed, and more added. In the lab, these animals will tolerate each other and share dens. Females mate and lay eggs over an extended period. As discussed in Chapter 7, octopus females usually brood one clutch of eggs and then die. The paper by Caldwell, Ross and colleagues does not contain field observations, but says that a company collecting sea life in Nicaragua knows of a single site where they aggregate. A field study is being prepared at the moment. In the meantime, we have Octopolis, and it's a very unusual sight. The more common pattern seen in octopuses is that an individual will make a den, live there for a short time, perhaps a few weeks, and then leave it to set up another. Males meet females to mate, often from a distance via the outstretched arm, but do not hang around to help the female as she broods the eggs. In general, there's not thought to be much interaction at all between adult octopuses. Even Octopus tetricus, the species at our site, appears to be a lot less social when observed elsewhere. So what happened at Octopolis? Some parts of what follows are speculative, but here's the story we've put together. Some time ago, a single object was dropped onto the sandy sea bottom, probably from a boat. The object was made of metal, but it's now completely overgrown with marine life. This object is only a foot or so long and high as it sits above the sea floor, but it's a valuable piece of real estate. The largest octopus on the site tends to live under it, and sometimes a few fish insist on living there too, huddling alongside an octopus who pretends not to notice them. This object, we think, was enough to seed the site in the same way a single object can seed the growth of a crystal. We think that a first octopus, or a few of them, made a den at the found object and began bringing scallops in to eat. The discarded shells accumulated and soon began to change the physical properties of the site. The shells are discs a few inches in diameter. They're a much better den-building material than fine sand, and soon a few more dens could be built on the outskirts of the first den. Those octopuses brought in still more scallops to eat, leaving still more shells. A positive feedback process was underway. The more octopuses that lived there, the more shells were brought in and the more dens could be built. This led to still more shells being brought in, and so on. Another possibility is that the dropping of the metal object coincided with the dropping of a first load of shells. This might have happened back before 1984, when scallop dredging was banned in the bay, or around 1990 when scallop collection by divers was also banned. That load of shells would have given the site a bigger kick-start. But since then it seems likely that most of the shells were brought in over the years by the octopuses. They have, by hunting and bringing food home, transformed the site where they live. Why did this seeding have such large effects at one particular site? The general area where the metal object fell offers unlimited food for an octopus, as it's a scallop bed. The scallops live singly or in little clumps. They're good food for an octopus. Despite the unlimited food, the area has very few good places for an octopus den. The sea floor is a fine sand that's hard to dig a stable hole in. And the predators in the area are numerous and deadly. We've seen dolphins and seals come zooming in to probe at the octopus dens. Several kinds of sharks live in the area. Huge carpet sharks, broad bottom-dwelling animals which look like old bomber planes, sometimes come and lie on our site for long periods as the octopuses huddle in their dens. Some years ago, Matt took a disturbing video a little way from the site when an octopus was caught out in the open by a school of aggressive small fish. Leatherjackets. These look like piranhas and gather in hundreds. They've taken a nip at me a couple of times. We don't know why this one octopus was targeted, but after some cautious feints, the fish attacked en masse and tore it to pieces. The octopus first tried to defend itself, then frantically to flee, zooming toward the surface, but it was dead within a couple of minutes. After that, I began to wonder how octopuses could survive in the area at all. Those fish are around much of the time, and octopuses frequently leave their dens to collect food. My best guess is that an octopus can travel a certain distance from its den in safety, even with fish watching, because if the fish attack, the octopus can be back in the den before damage is done. If the octopus goes outside that range, all bets are off. Very possibly the smaller octopuses have more to fear than larger ones, but there's not much an octopus can do against 100 darting piranhas. The leatherjackets prowl around, the seals zoom in, and the sharks cruise by and sit on the site. The most dramatic intruders of all are probably no direct threat to the octopuses. Occasionally the light goes dark, and an enormous black stingray comes sweeping in. These animals can be about as wide as a car, and they cruise in with great slow undulations of their wings. The octopuses duck. Our cameras, as I noted earlier, are usually scattered. Octopolis, with its deep shell-lined dens, seems an island of safety in a dangerous area, and this probably explains the octopus's consistent presence. But that raises a new question. Why don't the octopuses eat one another? At the site, I've seen octopuses as tiny as a matchbox, and others with an arm span over a metre across, with all sizes in between. Larger octopuses may not prey on each other due to the risk of fights, but what protects the tiny ones? Many octopuses are cannibalistic, including some close relatives of our Octopolis species. Why not in this case? This too might be because of the abundance of local food that does not put up a fight. All those scallops. Scallops, incidentally, do have eyes, with an unusual design that includes a mirror behind the retina. They can swim by flapping their shells. The first time I saw one move, I was startled. Swimming castanets. But these eyes and swimming skills are not nearly good enough to make a difference when octopuses are after them. They are helpless in that situation. Recapping the story as we see it. The intrusion of a foreign object made a rare, safe den. The first octopuses brought back scallops to eat and left the shells there. Soon the shells accumulated so much that they were the surface of the site. Eventually the shell debris made it possible to dig out stable dens in which others could live. The shell bed now extends so far that a newly dug den need not be very close to the main one. We still don't entirely understand what the shell bed is making possible. Some of the dens are quite deep, at least 40 centimetres or so, and we're pretty sure that some octopuses spend time entirely covered by shells, invisible. Octopuses may reach out and interact with each other beneath the surface, perhaps mating. We see movements of the shells coming from below with no octopus visible. As more octopuses settle there, their environment comes to consist more and more of the shells themselves. Our second paper about the site discussed this as a case of ecosystem engineering, the reshaping of an environment by the behaviour of the animals who live there. As we realised when we worked on that paper, it's not only the octopuses who've been affected by all this. Many other species seem to have been attracted to the site. Schools of fish now hover above it and zoom back and forth. This has sometimes interfered with our video data. Squid hang out, signalling to each other. The enormous carpet sharks who lie on the site are probably not primarily there to eat the octopuses. We caught one on video doing a spectacular ambush lunge into a school of fish above it. Baby sharks of another species lie on the shell bed for part of the year. Small decorated stingrays called banjo rays sit on the site also, with hermit crabs crawling about on their bodies. All of these creatures are present in much higher concentrations than are seen in areas just away from the site. The octopuses have built an artificial reef through their shell-collecting behaviours, and this seems to have led to an unusual social life developing, a life of high densities and continual interaction. One way to interpret our Octopolis observations is to think that they show that octopuses of this species, and perhaps others, are generally more social than people realise. Their signalling behaviours, the colour changes, the displays, do suggest this. A growing number of other studies push in the same direction. They suggest that octopuses are more engaged with each other than had once been thought. In 2011, a study of a species closely related to our octopolitans reported that octopuses could recognise other individual octopuses. A more controversial study from 1992 suggested that octopuses can learn by watching each other behave. Another interpretation, applicable to at least some of what we've seen, is that this particular site is unusual. In conjunction with the overall intelligence of octopuses, an unusual context has led to unusual behaviours. The octopuses have had to work out how to manage their lives in this setting, and some of the resulting behaviours are opportunistic and novel. They have had to work out how to get along. I suspect we're seeing a mix of new and old behaviours, some long-standing ones and some that are improvised modifications that arose by individual adaptation to unusual circumstances. Octopolis is a place where several elements that are usually missing from octopus life and that are relevant to the evolution of brains and minds are present. There's a lot of interaction and social navigation, and a lot of feedback between what is done and what is perceived. The octopuses face an unusually complicated environment because an important part of that environment is other octopuses. There is also constant manipulation and reshaping of the shell bed. They throw debris around, and the shells and other materials that are thrown often hit other octopuses. This might be a mere den-cleaning behaviour, but it's a behaviour that has new consequences in the crowded setting, as these projectiles do seem to affect the behaviour of the octopuses who are hit. We're trying at the moment to work out whether some of the throws are targeted. All this takes place in the context of the usual short octopus lifespan, as far as we know. Octopus life is brief, and there's no care of the young once they hatch. Suppose these octopuses live until they're about 2 years old. Since 2009, then, several generations have lived at the site. Many octopuses must have come and gone since we started visiting, and the animals continually remake the same complicated semi-sociality. We can imagine extra evolutionary steps that could be taken in a situation like this. Suppose the interactions became more complicated, the signaling more refined, the densities even higher. The life of each animal would become more caught up with the lives of others, and this would start to show in the ongoing evolution of their brains. We heard in Chapter 7 that lifespan is tuned by lifestyle, especially the threat of predation. If octopuses of this species could reliably make it through more years without being eaten, there is no reason why they could not eventually evolve a longer lifespan too. I'm not saying that all this could happen at Octopolis. It could not. This is one small site, a tiny fraction of the range occupied by the species. When octopus eggs hatch, the baby octopuses drift away rather than staying where they were born. Each, if it survives, settles somewhere and starts to wander. So there's no reason to believe that the octopuses at the site today are the children or grandchildren of others who lived there before. One site and a few years mean nothing in evolutionary terms. Arrangements like these would have to persist on a large scale for thousands of years to have much effect. But the site gives a glimpse of one possible road in the ongoing evolution of the octopus. Parallel lines. As we near the end of the book, let's look back at the evolution of bodies and minds. The oldest and most encrusted landmarks were described in Chapter 2, the ancient capacities for sensing and behaving, the evolution of animals from single-celled life, the first nervous systems. Then followed the evolution of the bilaterian body plan, the plan we share with bees and cephalopods. Soon after bilaterians appeared, there was a fork in the tree, with one side leading to vertebrates and another to a large range of invertebrate groups, insects, worms, mollusks. The to and fro of sensing and acting is characteristic of all known organisms, including single-celled life. In the transition to the first animals with nervous systems, the machinery of external sensing and signaling was turned inward, enabling coordination within these new, larger living units. Whatever nervous systems might have been doing initially, the transition from Ediacaran to Cambrian saw a new regime for animal behavior and the bodies that enable it. Organisms became entangled in each other's lives in new ways, especially as predator and prey. The tree continued to branch, a few brains expanded, and two experiments in very large nervous systems arose, one on the vertebrate side and one in the cephalopods. With those outlines in place, I'll look at some features of the tree of life that take on new relevance when we revisit them now. These are parts of the tree that become visible when we zoom in on some branches that in the early chapters were viewed only from further away. Looking first at the vertebrate side, we find ourselves and other mammals. But mammals are not the only vertebrates to evolve high degrees of intelligence. Fish and reptiles can do surprising things, but the main example I have in mind is birds such as parrots and crows. Vertebrate brains are all variations on a theme with much in common, but the branchings are still quite deep. The common ancestor of birds and humans, a lizard-like animal, lived perhaps 320 million years ago, sometime before the age of the dinosaurs. From there, large brains arose along several independent paths within vertebrates. I said in Chapter 3 that the history of large brains has the rough shape of a Y, with a vertebrate branch and a cephalopod branch. But this was quite a simplification. A closer look at the vertebrate side shows important internal branchings. I covered the early evolution of the cephalopods in Chapter 3 and wrote chapters on octopuses and cuttlefish. Both are cephalopods, but they're different in many ways. How did the history go on their side? Clearly there was a major branching in the evolution of cephalopods. How deep is it? For a while it was believed, based on the fossil record, that the first appearance of the group of cephalopods that includes octopuses, cuttlefish and squid, a group called the coleoids, occurred during the time of the dinosaurs, perhaps 170 million years ago. They diverged into their varied and familiar forms during the latter part of the dinosaurs' reign and afterward. In a famous paper from 1972, Andrew Packard argued that the evolution of these cephalopods occurred in parallel with the evolution of certain kinds of fish. From about 170 million years ago, some fish started to evolve into a familiar modern form. Earlier cephalopods were the old predators of the sea. Fish evolved new forms that competed with them, and the cephalopods evolved in response. This included the evolution of their complex behavior. The idea that modern cephalopods arose in one recent burst can be taken to support the view that large cephalopod nervous systems appeared in a kind of one-time evolutionary accident, followed by some later diversification. People have quite often taken a hypothesis of accidental intelligence in these animals seriously. Certainly there's been a temptation to think that octopuses in particular have too much brain for animals living such brief and asocial lives. Whether accident or not, the historical picture that Packard and others put in place encouraged the view that there was a single process, the evolution of large brains by the cephalopods, with minor variations arising afterward. The historical picture then changed. Packard based his view on fossil evidence, which is always sketchy with soft-bodied animals. Later, evidence from genetics was brought in, and the picture that resulted was different. The new view has it that the most recent common ancestor of octopuses, cuttlefish, and squid lived not 170 but 270 million years ago. That is the point at which an evolutionary split led to an octopod group on one side, including octopuses, and the deep-sea vampiromorpha, and a decapod, 10-footed group on the other, including squid and cuttlefish. Backdating this split by 100 million years puts the divergence of cephalopods into a very different evolutionary scenario. The time of the split is now in the Permian period, before the dinosaurs. Life in the oceans was very different then. There still might have been competition between cephalopods and fish, but the earlier date makes it much more likely that cephalopods evolved complex nervous systems at least twice, once in the lineage leading to octopuses, and once in the lineage leading to cuttlefish and squid. You might reply, it could be that the common ancestor of all those cephalopods had already gained a lot of behavioral complexity, and was the smartest animal living in the Permian seas. The date of the divergence does allow this reply, but other new evidence pulls against it. In 2015, the first octopus genome was sequenced. From the genes, we can read off some new information about how nervous systems are built within the lifetime of each individual. Building a nervous system requires sticking cells together in precise ways. In us, a family of molecules called protocadherins are used to do this. The same family of molecules, it turns out, are used when octopus nervous systems are built. That's interesting. Similar tools are used in both cases. But another finding came along with this. Those molecules used in the building of nervous systems have diversified in squid as well as octopuses, and they seem to have done this separately, after the split between those two groups. Octopus evolution includes one expansion of this family of molecules, and squid evolution has its own separate expansion. So these brain-building molecules have diversified at least 3 times, not just once in the cephalopods and once in animals like us. The significance of this depends on the extent to which cuttlefish and/or squid are genuinely smart animals. For these purposes, we can treat cuttlefish and squid as one group. We have less knowledge of cuttlefish cognition than we have for octopuses, and even less evidence about squid. But incoming evidence does suggest considerable brain power in the enigmatic cuttlefish as well. An example is a recent study of memory by Christelle José Alves and her group in Normandy, France, on a smaller species of cuttlefish than the giants of my earlier chapters. Memory in animals has several varieties. An important kind of memory in human experience is episodic memory, memory of particular events as opposed to memory of facts or skills. Your memory of your last birthday is an episodic memory. Your memory of how to swim is a procedural memory, and your memory of the location of France is a semantic memory. José Alves and her group based their cuttlefish experiment on a famous series of experiments that seemed to show something like episodic memory in birds, and the team on this study included a leading bird researcher, Nicola Clayton. In both the bird and cuttlefish studies, they talk of episodic-like memory, because episodic memory in humans has such a vivid element of subjective experience, and they don't know whether this is true of the other animals. Episodic-like memory in these tests was taken to be memory of where and when a certain kind of food was available. It is what, where, when memory. The cuttlefish tests went like this. First, the researchers worked out which of two foods, crab, shrimp, was preferred by each cuttlefish, and the cuttlefish were then placed in a situation where each food was associated with a different visual clue in the tank. Their more preferred food, which turned out to be shrimp, was replenished more slowly than the other one. If they ate shrimp, it took 3 hours before shrimp would be available in that spot again, while crab was replenished after 1 hour. The cuttlefish did learn that if they were released into the tank just 1 hour after their last meal of shrimp, there was no point in going to the shrimp location again, as there would be nothing there. After a 1-hour delay, they went to the crab location. If the delay was 3 hours, they went for the shrimp. The existence of episodic-like memory in all these groups, mammals like us, birds, cuttlefish, is a striking example of what is almost certainly parallel evolution in these different lines. I don't know if anyone has tried a similar experiment with octopuses, and I don't know how they would do with the task. The José Alves study shows quite complex cognition on the decapod branch in brains that evolved somewhat separately from those in octopuses. In other words, this is evidence of parallel evolution of intelligence within the cephalopods. This buttresses the view that it was no accident that complex nervous systems evolved in cephalopods. It's not something that happened once and was kept on with variations in a couple of different lines. Instead, there was an expansion of the nervous system within the octopus line and another one in parallel in the other cephalopods. The relation between octopuses and cuttlefish is looking quite analogous to the relation between mammals and birds. In the vertebrate line, a split around 320 million years ago led to mammals and birds, each evolving large brains within somewhat different bodies. In cephalopods, octopuses and cuttlefish are both built on the molluscan plan, but the separation between them has something like the same historical depth, and there was parallel evolution of large brains here also. A fragment of the tree of life. The tree could be thought of like this, from left to right, with many fish, mammals, birds, squid and cuttlefish, octopods, other mollusks, countless arthropods, jellyfish, and sponges branching off from the central stem of the tree. This fragment of the tree of life represents some of the branchings that figure in this book. Mammals and birds are large groups with respect to the number of species within them, while the two cephalopod groups on each side of their fork are much smaller. Mammals and birds are each a class in the traditional framework of biological classification, while all the cephalopods make up one class. Arthropods towards the right are an entire phylum consisting of a huge number of insects, crabs, spiders, centipedes, and others. Many groups are omitted from the fragment. If earthworms were included, for example, they'd be between the other mollusks and the arthropods branching off that short stem leading to the mollusks. Starfish would be over near the vertebrates on the left. Fish don't make up a single branch. Most fish are on the far left branch, but some, such as the coelacanth, are on the branch that leads also to us and birds. Cephalopods have been large predators since ancient times. About 270 million years or so ago, one group of cephalopods split, probably after they'd embarked on their crucial relinquishing of an external shell. At least two lines evolved large nervous systems separately, cephalopods and smart vertebrates. are independent experiments in the evolution of the mind. Like mammals and birds, the octopuses and cuttlefish of this book represent sub-experiments within that larger experiment. The oceans. The mind evolved in the sea. Water made it possible. All the early stages took place in water. The origin of life, the birth of animals, the evolution of nervous systems and brains, and the appearance of the complex bodies that make brains worth having. The first ventures onto land probably took place not long after the history charted in my first chapters, certainly by 420 million years ago, perhaps earlier. But the early history of animals is a history of life in the sea. When animals did crawl onto dry land, they took the sea with them. All the basic activities of life occur in water-filled cells bounded by membranes, tiny containers whose insides are remnants of the sea. I said in Chapter 1 that meeting an octopus is in many ways the closest we're likely to get to meeting an intelligent alien. Yet it's not really an alien. The Earth and its oceans made us both. The features that made the sea productive of life and mind are invisible to us most of the time. They exist on a tiny scale. The sea does not change visibly as we do things to it, not in the way that cutting down a forest is immediately, undeniably visible. Waste poured into the sea just seems to drift and dilute away. As a result, the sea rarely appears urgent as an environmental problem, and measures we might take to help it often achieve little that's readily seen. Sometimes the effects of our actions are visible once you take even a casual look below the surface. I began thinking about this book around 2008. I'd bought a small apartment near the shore in Sydney, where I went during the northern summers. Like all the beaches up and down the coast around Sydney, this area had been fished for too long by too many people, and by the new millennium the waters had been just about emptied. But in 2002, one small bay was designated a marine sanctuary, with complete protection of its wildlife. Within a few years it was teeming with fish and other animals, and there I encountered the cephalopods that prompted me to write the book. The efficacy of sanctuaries is encouraging, but the sea faces enormous threats. Overfishing the oceans is the most obvious, with more and more of what swims being hauled indiscriminately into the freezers of boats. Our ability to manage this is hampered not just by greed and competing interests, but by the difficulty of getting a handle on the problem and understanding our own destructive capacities. The sea looks the same after the boats are gone. In the late 19th century, following the publication of On the Origin of Species, Thomas Huxley was Charles Darwin's most important scientific ally and a leading biologist in his own right. By the middle 1800s, the fishers in the North Sea began to wonder whether they might exhaust their stocks of fish, and Huxley was invited to comment. He said there was little reason to worry. He did some simple calculations of the productivity of the sea and the fraction of fish being taken out, and concluded in a speech in 1883, "I believe that it may be affirmed with confidence that in relation to our present modes of fishing, a number of the most important sea fisheries, such as the cod fishery, the herring fishery, and the mackerel fishery, are inexhaustible." He was spectacularly wrong in his optimism. Within a few decades, many of these fisheries, especially the cod, were in serious trouble. As a result of his confident assurances, Huxley has become something of a villain. That is not unreasonable, though the villainizers do tend to overlook and sometimes omit a part of the infamous quote that I have included, "in relation to our present modes of fishing." Huxley may have been wrong even with this qualification in place. But one thing that certainly sent people down the wrong path was their inability to recognize how much fishing technology would change. This led, in turn, to massive changes in how many fish each boat could take from the sea. With the growing mechanization of gear, then freezers and high-tech means for tracking the fish, our present modes of fishing were gone not long after Huxley's optimistic words, and so were the fish. Overfishing began in the 19th century and continues, with more meagre returns to this day. The other problem the sea faces is chemical change. This is even harder to see and more global in its sources, and as a result even harder to fix. One example is acidification. As the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere rises due to burning fossil fuels, some of the extra CO2 dissolves into the sea. There it changes the water's pH balance, pushing it away from its usual state of mild alkalinity. The metabolisms of a great many sea animals, including cephalopods, are affected by this. And there are especially serious effects on corals and other organisms that make hard parts out of calcium. Those hard parts soften and dissolve in the altered sea. In the later stages of writing this book, I had lunch with a bee biologist, Andrew Barron. I met with him and Colin Klein, another philosopher, to discuss how we could possibly work out the evolutionary origins of subjective experience. When I heard that Andrew works on bees, I also wanted to ask him about colony collapse, the problem that has been affecting bees worldwide. The problem became apparent around 2007. Across many countries, bee colonies quite suddenly started failing, and consequently failing to pollinate all sorts of crops that rely on them, apples, strawberries, and many others. Given the economic importance of bees as pollinators, the cause of the collapses has been intensely studied. It has to be something worldwide, not local. But the collapse came on pretty quickly. Is it a parasite, a fungus, chemical toxins? When I asked Barron, he said, yes, they are starting to get a handle on what's going on. So what's the factor that's causing it? He replied that as far as they can tell, there is no single factor. Instead, over many years, more and more small stresses have appeared in the lives of bees. More pollutants, more new microorganisms, less habitat. For a long while, as these stresses accumulated, bees were able to cope. Colonies absorbed the stress by working harder. Although they weren't obviously and visibly suffering, the capacity of the bees to buffer these problems was being slowly worn out. Eventually, a critical point was reached, and honeybee colonies just started to fail. They failed dramatically, visibly, not because some sudden pest had swept through, but because their capacity to absorb the stresses had run out. Now fruit farmers desperately truck bee colonies thousands of miles from orchard to orchard, trying to get their crops pollinated with the bees that are still healthy enough to do the job. I took that story on board, and now look at the ocean in the same way. This sphere of biological creativity is so vast that for centuries we could do whatever we liked to it and have little impact. But now our capacity to stress its systems is much greater. It absorbs the stresses, not invisibly, but often in ways that are hard to see and easy to ignore when money is involved. In some places, it's already been pushed too far. In many parts of the world's seas, there are dead zones, where no animals and little else can survive, due especially to the loss of oxygen. Dead zones probably arose naturally from time to time before human stress on the ocean, but they now occur on a much larger scale. Some of them come and go seasonally, following a malign rhythm set by fertilizer runoff from farms on land nearby, while others seem more permanent. Dead zone, the very opposite of an ocean. There are many reasons for us to appreciate and care for the oceans, and I hope this book has added one. When you dive into the sea, you are diving into the origin of us all.
We hope you've enjoyed Other Minds, a Macmillan audiobook production from Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Text copyright 2016 by Peter Godfrey Smith. Production copyright 2017 by Macmillan Audio. All rights reserved.